On a quiet evening in September of 2017, a woman living in Massachusetts arrived home after a long and exhausting day at work. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway as she parked her car and made her way to the front door. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was immediately struck by how silent the house was. Usually, her boyfriend would be home by this time, and the house would be filled with the normal sounds of dinner being prepared or the television playing in the background. But tonight, there was only a heavy, unsettling silence. She called out his name, but no one answered. She walked deeper into the house, heading toward the kitchen, and that was when she noticed his keys, his wallet, and his cell phone sitting right there on the kitchen counter. This was the first major red flag. Her boyfriend never went anywhere without his phone and his wallet, so the fact that they were left behind meant he must have departed in a massive hurry or something was seriously wrong. As she stood in the kitchen, feeling a growing sense of unease, her eyes drifted over to the kitchen table. Sitting directly in the center of the wooden table were 3 white envelopes. They had been laid out very neatly, side by side, in a highly conspicuous manner. She walked over to the table, her heart beginning to beat a little faster in her chest. She reached down and picked up the first envelope. When she opened it, she was shocked to find her boyfriend's last will and testament. Her hands began to shake as she set it down and picked up the second envelope, which was a personal letter addressed to her. She opened it and began to read, and the words on the page filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was written like a final goodbye, containing deeply emotional sentiments but also carrying a dark, desperate tone that she could not fully comprehend. With trembling fingers, she finally reached for the third envelope. When she looked at the front of it, she saw that it was addressed to the family of a woman named Lisa Ziggert. This name sent a chill straight down her spine. Lisa Ziggert was a young woman who had been brutally murdered 25 years earlier in their home state of Massachusetts. It was one of the most famous and haunting cold cases in the history of the entire region, a mystery that had baffled investigators and terrified the local community for a quarter of a century. The girlfriend stood frozen in her quiet kitchen, clutching the letter, suddenly realizing that the man she loved, the man she shared her life with, was somehow connected to a terrible crime from decades ago. To understand how this bizarre and tragic moment came to be, we have to go all the way back to the afternoon of April 15th, 1992. On that day, a vibrant 24-year-old woman named Lisa Ziggert was driving her car through the peaceful, tree-lined streets of Agawam, Massachusetts. Lisa was a young woman who was deeply loved by everyone who knew her. She was kind, patient, and possessed a warm, gentle personality that made people feel instantly comfortable around her. Her true passion in life was working with children, and she had managed to land a job as a teacher's aide at the local middle school. She took her responsibilities at the school very seriously, always going out of her way to help the students who were struggling and bringing a positive, encouraging energy to the classroom every single day. But while teaching was undoubtedly her calling, the reality of her situation was that being a teacher's aide did not pay very much money. Lisa was trying to build a stable life for herself, but she struggled to pay her bills and make ends meet on her school salary alone. So, in order to earn some much-needed extra income, she took on a second job working the evening shift at a local retail store called Brittany's Card and Gift Shop. The shop was located in a busy commercial plaza in the very center of Agawam, surrounded by various other local businesses, including restaurants, beauty salons, and retail stores. It was a cozy, pleasant shop that sold specialty items like birthday cards, fancy wrapping paper, stuffed animals, holiday decorations, and delicate glass music boxes. As Lisa drove into the shopping plaza on that afternoon in April, the parking lot was already beginning to fill up with people running errands after work. As she slowly cruised through the lanes looking for an open parking space, she passed by a popular local chicken restaurant where her close friend Ed Borgatti was working. Ed was a central figure in Lisa's social circle. He actually shared a house with Lisa's boyfriend, Blair Masoya, as well as Lisa's sister, Lynn. Because of this living arrangement, the four of them were incredibly close, constantly hanging out, sharing meals, and supporting one another. As Lisa saw Ed's car parked outside the restaurant, she briefly considered parking nearby and popping in to say a quick hello to him before her shift started. But when she glanced at the digital clock on her dashboard, she realized she was running a bit late. She did not want to risk being tardy for her shift, so she decided to bypass the restaurant and drove straight to the card shop, parked her car, and went inside to start her work. By the time 7 o'clock that evening rolled around, Lisa was sitting behind the counter of the card shop, trying to pass the time. The store was quiet, and she was humming along to the music drifting from the overhead speakers. Lisa was the only employee scheduled to work the evening shifts, meaning she was entirely responsible for helping customers, running the cash register, and locking up the building at 9 o'clock. Working completely alone late at night was something that had always made Lisa feel a bit anxious. The storefront consisted of massive glass windows that looked out onto the parking lot, and at night, when the lights were on inside the shop, she felt incredibly exposed to anyone walking by outside. To make matters worse, she occasionally had to deal with difficult or disruptive customers. The shopping plaza housed a pool hall just a few doors down, and later in the evening, rowdy patrons would sometimes wander out of the pool hall and walk into the card shop. They were often loud, boisterous, and sometimes downright rude, which kept Lisa on edge during her solo shifts. But beyond the typical stress of retail work, Lisa had been experiencing a much more disturbing sensation over the past couple of weeks. She had been plagued by a persistent creepy feeling that someone was actively watching her through the front windows of the store while she was working. She could not point to any specific person, and she had never seen anyone lurking outside, but the feeling was so intense and instinctual that it kept her in a constant state of mild panic. As Lisa sat behind the counter, trying to focus on her work and calm her nerves, she suddenly heard the familiar jingle of the bell hanging above the front door. The sound made her jump slightly, and she quickly whipped around to see who was entering the shop. To her immense relief, she saw that it was not a rowdy customer or a threatening stranger, but rather her older sister, Lynn. Lisa was incredibly close with Lynn, and her sister would often make a point to stop by the card shop during Lisa's evening shifts just to chat, bring her a snack, and keep her company so she would not feel so isolated. Lynn walked up to the counter, greeted her sister with a warm smile, and asked her how the shift was going. Lisa sighed and admitted that the night was slow, but she quickly shifted the conversation to her career. She told Lynn how frustrated she was that she had not been able to secure a full-time, permanent teaching job yet. She explained that she loved working with the middle school students, but she desperately wanted a position that paid a living wage so that she could finally quit her job at the card shop. She confessed to Lynn that the late-night shifts were starting to creep her out more and more, and she hated the feeling of being vulnerable in the store by herself. Furthermore, she explained that working 2 jobs left her completely exhausted and gave her almost no free time to spend with her boyfriend, Blair, whom she loved dearly. The 2 sisters stood by the counter and talked for about half an hour, sharing laughs and catching up on family news. The conversation was a wonderful distraction for Lisa, helping her to forget about her anxieties for a short while. But eventually, Lynn had to get back home. Lisa walked her sister to the front door, opened it, and waved goodbye as Lynn walked out into the cool evening air. As Lisa stood in the open doorway of the shop, watching her sister drive away, she was struck by how incredibly busy the parking plaza had become. There were long lines of cars slowly navigating the driving lanes, with drivers honking their horns at one another as they battled for the few remaining parking spaces. While Lisa was standing there, taking in the chaotic scene, she looked over and saw James Dent, the friendly owner of the carpet shop located directly next door, walking out to lock his front doors for the night. James noticed Lisa standing in her doorway, smiled, and walked over to exchange a few words. He gestured to the crowded parking lot and made a comment about how absolutely crazy the traffic was tonight. Lisa laughed and agreed, noting that while the plaza was always somewhat busy in the evenings, tonight seemed far more chaotic than usual. After a brief and pleasant chat, James wished her a good night, turned, and walked toward his vehicle. Lisa smiled, stepped back inside the card shop, and closed the door, locking out the noise of the busy parking lot. About an hour later, at 20 minutes past 8 o'clock, Lisa was standing behind the register, ringing up what would turn out to be her final customer of the night. She processed the transaction, handed the customer his change along with his receipt, and wished him a pleasant evening. Once the door closed and she was alone again, Lisa decided to head into the back storage room to take inventory of some newly arrived items before she began her closing routine. She was feeling a sense of relief that her long double-shift day was finally coming to an end. In just 40 minutes, she would lock the front doors, shut off the lights, and perhaps walk over to the chicken restaurant to see if Ed was still there. They could catch up for a few minutes, and then she would finally head home to get some well-deserved rest. But just as she was sorting through some inventory boxes in the quiet back room, she heard the sudden, sharp jingle of the bell above the front door, signaling that someone else had just walked into the shop. Lisa placed her clipboard down on a box, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the back room to see who had entered the store so close to closing time. The following morning, which was April 16, 1992, Detective Wayne Macy of the Agawam Police Department pulled his cruiser into the parking lot of the shopping plaza. As he got out of his car, he saw that the area in front of Brittany's card and gift shop was already crowded with police vehicles, and officers were busy stretching bright yellow crime scene tape across the storefront. Macy, a seasoned investigator, walked up to the entrance and stepped inside the brightly lit store. One of the responding patrol officers immediately walked over to Macy to fill him in on the details of the situation. The officer explained that earlier that morning, a woman named Sophia, who was another employee at the card shop, had called 911 to report a highly suspicious situation. Sophia had arrived at the plaza around 8 o'clock to start her morning shift, but as she was parking her car, she noticed that Lisa's vehicle was still parked in the lot. This was immediately concerning, as Lisa had worked the closing shift the night before and had no reason to be at the store so early in the morning. Sophia walked up to the front door of the shop and was surprised to find that the door was completely unlocked. When she pushed it open and stepped inside, she found that all the interior lights were still on and the overhead music was still playing throughout the store, just as it had been the night before. Sophia had walked through the entire retail area, calling out Lisa's name, but she received no response. She searched the counter area, the small office, and the restrooms, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. However, her concern turned to panic when she realized that Lisa's purse, her keys, and all her personal belongings were still sitting behind the counter. Realizing that Lisa would never have left the store unlocked overnight and abandoned her personal belongings, Sophia immediately contacted the police. The officer also informed Macy that they had already spoken to James Dent, the owner of the carpet store next door. James confirmed that he had spoken to Lisa around 7:30 the previous evening and that she had seemed completely normal, happy, and showed no signs of distress whatsoever. Macy asked the officer if anyone had been in contact with Lisa's family or friends. The officer replied that they had reached out to her family and none of them had seen or heard from her since the previous evening. Additionally, Lisa's roommate had confirmed that Lisa never returned to their shared apartment and she had also failed to show up for her morning shift as a teacher's aide at the middle school. At this point, the patrol officer looked at Detective Macy and told him that he needed to come into the back room of the shop immediately. He stated that what they had discovered in the back made it absolutely clear that they were dealing with a case of foul play. Macy nodded and followed the officer through the retail space, passing displays of stuffed animals and greeting cards, and stepped into the small back storage room. The moment Macy looked inside, his heart sank. The room was in a state of utter chaos. Numerous large cardboard boxes that had been stacked against the wall had been knocked over and completely flattened on the floor, indicating that a violent physical struggle had taken place in the tight space. More alarmingly, there was a significant amount of wet, red blood splattered across the flattened cardboard boxes. Based on the physical evidence, it was incredibly obvious to Macy that Lisa had been violently attacked. Because her car, keys, and purse were still at the store, she had clearly been taken from the scene by force. As Macy walked around the cramped storage room, carefully avoiding the blood splattered on the floor, he noticed that a heavy metal door at the very back of the room was standing partially open. He walked over and pushed it open further, revealing that it led directly into a narrow, dark alleyway that ran behind the entire shopping plaza. He looked down at the threshold of the door and noticed several distinct scuff marks on the concrete floor. It looked as though someone had been forcefully dragged out of the back room, and their shoes had dragged along the ground as they were pulled through the doorway and into the alley outside. Macy stepped out into the quiet alleyway, looking up and down the brick walls of the building to see if there were any security cameras mounted on the exterior. But there was nothing. He walked back inside, went out the front door, and began visiting all the neighboring businesses in the plaza. He asked the owners and employees if they had any security cameras installed that might have captured the front of the card shop or the parking lot on the previous night. To his deep disappointment, Macy learned that not a single business in the entire shopping plaza had any security cameras. Macy knew right then and there that this was going to be an incredibly challenging investigation. He had no eyewitnesses to the abduction, no security camera footage to analyze, and no physical description of a suspect or a getaway vehicle. He immediately walked back to his police car, grabbed his radio, and contacted dispatch. He ordered a massive search effort, requesting search teams, police K-9 units, and state police helicopters to scour the entire town of Agawam and the surrounding wilderness for any sign of Lisa. Once the search was organized, Macy went back inside the card shop to check the cash register. He wanted to determine if the abduction had been the result of a robbery gone wrong. But when he opened the drawer, he found that all the cash from the previous day's sales was still inside, completely untouched. He knew that random abductions by strangers were incredibly rare, and in the vast majority of violent crimes, the perpetrator is someone who is close to the victim. Macy pressed a series of buttons on the register, printing out the transaction log from the previous night. He saw that the very last transaction had occurred at exactly 8:20 p.m. This was a critical piece of information. Since the store was scheduled to close at 9 o'clock, this narrow timeline meant that the attack and abduction must have occurred during the 40-minute window between 8:20 and 9 p.m., a time when the parking lot was still busy, but many of the retail shops were closing up. That afternoon, Detective Macy drove to the home of Lisa's parents. The search at the shopping plaza was fully underway, and a team of officers was already searching Lisa's apartment for any clues. Macy wanted to speak with her family to gather any information that might help point them in the right direction. When Lisa's mother opened the door, she looked pale, exhausted, and absolutely terrified, but she was relieved to see a detective. She invited him inside. As Macy stepped into the dining room, he was met with a scene of frantic activity. The house was filled with at least a dozen young people, most of them around Lisa's age, who had gathered around the large dining table. They had a massive map of the area spread out across the table and were actively planning their own search parties. When they saw the detective, they rushed over, desperately asking for updates. They wanted to know if she had been found, where the police were searching, and if there were any leads. Macy calmly told the group that he would speak to everyone, but he needed to interview Lisa's mother first. The group understood, and they quietly stepped back. Macy and Lisa's mother went into the living room and sat down. Macy asked her if there was anyone in Lisa's life who might have a grudge against her, or if Lisa had any enemies. Her mother immediately shook her head and said that there was absolutely no one. She explained that Lisa was an incredibly sweet, kind, and hardworking young woman who loved her job and her family. She stayed out of trouble, had no conflicts with anyone, and was loved by everyone who met her. Throughout the interview, which lasted for over half an hour, her mother repeatedly emphasized that Lisa was a good person and that this situation made absolutely no sense. Over the course of the afternoon, Macy interviewed several other people who had gathered at the house, including Lisa's father, her sister Lynn, her roommate, her boyfriend Blair, and Blair's roommate Ed Borgatti. Blair was visibly devastated by his girlfriend's disappearance. He was crying hysterically and seemed completely overwhelmed by grief and fear. When Macy asked Blair where he had been the previous night, Blair explained that he had spent the evening at his mother's home, except for a brief trip to a local CVS store. He could not recall the exact time of the trip, but he mentioned that he had kept the receipt from the purchase at his apartment. Macy then spoke with Ed Borgatti, who also appeared to be deeply upset about Lisa's disappearance. Ed confirmed that he and Lisa were good friends and that he had been working his shift at the chicken restaurant right next to the card shop around the time she went missing. Macy listened closely to Ed's statement. He knew that in cases of abduction and murder, the killer is often someone known to the victim. Here was a young man who was close friends with Lisa, who was working just a few hundred feet away from her at the exact time she was attacked and who knew her schedule. It was an incredibly strong lead, and Macy made a mental note to investigate Ed's background thoroughly and speak with Lisa's friends to see if there was any hidden tension between them. However, as Macy went around the room and questioned Lisa's friends, none of them had anything negative to say about Ed or Blair. They all insisted that both men cared for Lisa deeply and that there was no conflict. But one of Lisa's friends did share a detail that caught Macy's attention. She said that about a week prior to her disappearance, Lisa had mentioned having a strange feeling that someone was watching her while she was working at the card shop. Unfortunately, Lisa had not provided any specific details about why she felt that way or who she thought might be watching her. Macy knew this was an interesting detail, but without any names or descriptions, it was virtually impossible to follow up on. He felt frustrated. He had no eyewitnesses, no security footage, no obvious motive, and no clear suspects. The only useful physical detail he had was from Lisa's sister Lynn, who was able to describe exactly what Lisa was wearing on the night she disappeared: a denim skirt, boots, and a unique charm bracelet. Macy left the house feeling disappointed by how little he had uncovered, hoping that the search teams would have more success. 3 days later, on the afternoon of Sunday, April 19, 1992, Detective Macy parked his cruiser at the edge of a dense wooded area off Route 75, less than a mile from the shopping plaza. Seconds later, another police cruiser pulled up directly behind him. Earlier that afternoon, a local resident had been out walking his dog in these woods when he came across what appeared to be a deceased body and immediately called the police. As Macy got out of his car, he saw tire tracks in the mud near the edge of the road, just as the caller had described. Macy knew that if the body was in the woods, these tracks might lead them straight to it. He and 3 other officers began walking into the tree line following the tire tracks. But as they took their first steps, they realized how difficult the terrain was going to be. The ground was incredibly swampy, and Macy's boots immediately sank deep into the thick, wet mud up to his ankles. The area was so wet and unstable that the officers had to walk in a single file line, carefully stepping directly into each other's footprints to avoid getting stuck in the deep mud. They continued to trudge deeper into the dense woods, following the tire tracks until they eventually began to fade away in the thick brush. Macy and the other officers stopped and looked around, but they could not see any sign of a body. The dog walker had told them that the body was located further in the direction the tracks were heading. So the officers kept moving forward, maintaining their single file line, slowly making their way through the thick branches and heavy mud. After a long, exhausting search, they finally broke through the dense trees into a small, isolated clearing. As Macy stepped into the clearing, he immediately saw items of clothing scattered across the ground. The sun was beginning to set and the woods were growing dark. Macy pulled out his flashlight, turned it on, and began sweeping the beam of light across the clearing. The bright light cut through the shadows, and suddenly, the beam landed on the body of a young woman lying near the base of a tree. She was partially clothed, and it was immediately clear to the officers that she had been brutally assaulted before she died. She had multiple stab wounds all over her body, including a severe wound to her throat. Macy walked over, knelt down in the damp grass next to the body, and shined his flashlight on her wrist. The light reflected off a metal charm bracelet. It was Lisa Ziggert. Within an hour, the quiet clearing was filled with activity. A forensics team arrived and set up heavy generators which roared to life, powering massive floodlights that illuminated the entire area. Overhead, a police helicopter began circling the woods, taking aerial photographs of the scene. Macy stood back, watching the technicians work. As he looked at the surrounding landscape, he realized how thick and confusing these woods were. It would be incredibly easy for someone to get lost in here, especially at night. This suggested to Macy that the killer was likely a local resident who knew this specific wooded area very well. Furthermore, given how deep the tire tracks went into the swampy mud, Macy figured that the killer must have been driving a vehicle with four-wheel drive, such as a truck, an SUV, or a Jeep, to avoid getting stuck. He instructed the forensics team to carefully create plaster casts of the tire tracks left near the road. He also hoped that the technicians would be able to find and collect the killer's DNA from Lisa's body, which could prove to be the key to solving the case. A few days later, Macy was back at his desk at the police department. The phone lines in the office were ringing constantly, creating a chaotic environment, but Macy tried his best to ignore the noise and focus on his paperwork. The forensics team had indeed managed to isolate a clean DNA sample of the killer from Lisa's body. Now, Macy's task was to compile a list of potential suspects and begin collecting DNA samples from them to see if any of them matched. Lisa's boyfriend, Blair, was still at the top of the list, despite having no obvious motive and having provided the CVS receipt. Macy knew that a drive from the CVS to the card shop would only take about 3 minutes, meaning Blair could have easily slipped away, committed the crime, and used the receipt as a calculated alibi. Another highly suspicious individual was Blair's roommate, Ed. His alibi of working at the nearby restaurant was almost too convenient. Macy speculated that Ed could have easily walked over to the card shop during a quiet moment in his shift, attacked Lisa, hidden her body in the back, and then returned later after his shift to transport her to the woods in his Jeep. Ed owned a Jeep which perfectly matched the profile of a vehicle capable of navigating the muddy woods. Macy knew he needed to get DNA samples and tire impressions from both Blair and Ed as soon as possible. But as he sat at his desk, the endless ringing of the office phones became too loud to ignore. He stood up, walked out into the main bullpen, and asked one of the officers why there were so many incoming calls. The officer explained that the calls were all tips for the newly established Lisa Ziggert tip line. The officer told Macy that the news coverage of the search, the police helicopters, and the massive floodlights in the woods had sparked intense public interest. As soon as the media announced that Lisa's body had been found, the entire town of Agawam began calling in with their own theories. People were reporting suspicious vehicles they had seen weeks ago, describing strange men hanging around the area, and sharing rumors. Macy instructed the officer to ensure that every single tip was documented and logged. He knew that they would have to investigate each one, even if most of them turned out to be dead ends. As he walked back to his office, listening to the phones ring, he realized that their investigation was going to be much larger and more complicated than he had hoped. In the early 1990s, there was no national DNA database like CODIS where they could simply upload a profile and wait for a match. The only way to find a match was to collect a blood or saliva sample from a specific suspect and manually compare it to the DNA found at the crime scene. If they did not have a specific name to test, the DNA sample from the crime scene was virtually useless. 1 year later, in 1993, Detective Macy was standing in his office, looking at the stacks of cardboard boxes that now filled the room. Each box was stuffed with police reports, interview logs, and tip sheets related to the Ziggert investigation. For 12 months, Macy and his team had been working nonstop, following up on every lead they received, but they were no closer to finding the killer. Because Agawam was a tight-knit community, Lisa's murder was a constant topic of conversation. The police department had received hundreds of calls. They had even been forced to set up a dedicated phone room to handle the volume. No matter how wild or unlikely a tip seemed, the detectives felt obligated to investigate it. For instance, a woman who worked at the local all-female gym where Lisa was a member called to report a suspicious man. She claimed that this man would show up at the gym every single afternoon at 3 o'clock, purchase a frozen yogurt from the juice bar, and stand there eating it while staring intently at the women working out. The employee was convinced he was the killer. Another tip came from a local resident who claimed to have seen a police car parked near the card shop on the night of the abduction. This tip was so concerning that Macy ordered a DNA test for every single officer in the Agawam Police Department. Every officer complied, but not a single one matched the DNA of the killer. There was also a highly dramatic rumor circulating that Blair and his roommate Ed were secretly involved in a romantic relationship, and that Ed had murdered Lisa because she had discovered their secret. Another tipster called to report that their friend had borrowed their car on the day of the murder and returned it with mysterious bloodstains on the seats. There were also dozens of women who called the tip line to accuse their own husbands of being the killer, providing various reasons for their suspicions. And then there were hundreds of tips that were simply too vague to be useful, such as reports of a man wearing a dark jacket, walking down a road, or a customer who seemed rude at a bar. By the end of the first year, Macy's team had identified and investigated over 400 potential suspects. But to Macy's profound disappointment, none of these leads had led to an arrest. The two most promising suspects, Blair and Ed, had been ruled out early in the investigation. Their tire treads did not match the casts taken from the woods, and their DNA samples did not match the evidence found on Lisa's body. Obtaining DNA samples from the other 400 suspects had proven to be an incredibly difficult task. In 1993, DNA testing required a significant amount of blood, meaning suspects had to go to a medical clinic to have their blood drawn. Many of the people of interest refused to do this, and because the tips against them were so weak, Macy did not have the necessary legal probable cause to obtain a search warrant to force them. For the select few who did agree to provide a sample, none of them matched the killer's DNA. As Macy stood in his office surrounded by the physical evidence of a year of hard work, he felt a sense of dread. He worried that the answer was not in any of those boxes. Every lead he had followed had ended in a dead end, leaving him more confused than before. He realized that without new evidence or an eyewitness, the case would remain unsolved. He needed more information, and he hoped that a broader appeal to the public might generate the lead he needed. 6 months later, in the fall of 1993, Detective Macy found himself in Burbank, California. He was standing in a large call center owned by the production company of the television show Unsolved Mysteries. The show was preparing to air a detailed segment about the murder of Lisa Ziggert, and Macy had traveled to California to monitor the phone lines in real time as the episode broadcasted across the country. As the segment began to play on television screens, the phones in the call center immediately began to ring. Macy walked through the rows of cubicles, listening to the operators speak with callers from all over the United States. He hoped that someone, somewhere, would provide a crucial piece of information that would break the case open. But as the hours passed, Macy's hope turned to frustration. The vast majority of the calls coming in were from people in the Agawam area who were simply repeating the same old rumor that Ed Borgatti was the killer. Because the police had never publicly announced that Ed had been cleared by DNA, the local community had developed a conspiracy theory. They believed that the police were covering up Ed's involvement because he was a local resident. Macy had hoped that the national television exposure would reach a witness who had left the area or someone with genuine information, but instead, they were just receiving more local gossip. By the end of the night, the broadcast had generated over 200 tips, but after weeks of follow-up work back in Massachusetts, none of them proved to be useful. As the years slowly turned into decades, the tips dried up and the investigation went cold. By the time Detective Macy retired in 2003, 11 years after the murder, the case remained unsolved. The boxes of files were moved to a storage room where they sat gathering dust. Then, in January of 2015, 23 years after Lisa's death, a newly elected district attorney named Anthony Galloon walked into the Agawam police headquarters. He was determined to reopen the case. Galloon had grown up in the area and vividly remembered the fear and sadness that gripped the town when Lisa was killed. He had been 12 years old at the time, and the mystery had stayed with him his entire life. Galloon met with Detective Mark Fowle, who was now in charge of the cold case files. Galloon explained that forensic science had advanced significantly since the early 90s. He suggested that they submit the killer's DNA sample for a process called DNA phenotyping. This cutting-edge technology allowed scientists to analyze specific genetic markers in a DNA sample to determine the physical characteristics of the individual, such as their eye color, skin tone, and facial structure. While this would not give them a direct name, it would allow them to build an incredibly accurate composite sketch of what the killer looked like. Galloon believed that if they could create a visual profile of the suspect and compare it to their list of historical suspects, they might finally be able to identify the killer. It took more than a year and a half for the testing and analysis to be completed. Finally, in September of 2016, District Attorney Galloon held a major press conference. Standing before the media, he revealed a new, highly detailed composite sketch of the killer. The image showed a young Caucasian man with dark hair and brown or hazel eyes. Although the face did not immediately ring a bell for any of the active investigators, Galloon hoped that a member of the public would recognize the physical features. Following the press conference, Galloon and a state trooper began a systematic review of the entire case archive. They went through every single box of files, specifically looking for the names of men who had been identified as suspects or persons of interest during the original investigation, but who had refused to provide a DNA sample. After weeks of meticulous work, they compiled a list of 11 men who had refused to cooperate with the police in the 90s and who perfectly matched the physical characteristics shown in the new phenotyping sketch. Armed with this new scientific profile and the historical evidence, Galloon was able to convince a judge to issue search warrants, forcing all 11 men to provide a DNA sample. But before the testing process could even begin for all the men, Galloon received an unexpected phone call. A detective on the other end of the line explained that a woman had just contacted the police department with information that would change everything. Based on a subsequent written confession and forensic evidence, investigators were finally able to piece together the exact sequence of events that occurred on the night of April 15, 1992. At approximately 8:30 that evening, a man named Gary Shera parked his vehicle in the dark, quiet alleyway behind Brittany's card and gift shop. He got out of his car, walked around to the front of the shopping plaza, and hid behind a parked vehicle. From this position, he could look through the large front glass windows of the card shop, where he watched Lisa Ziggert as she moved around the store. Shera had struggled with dark, violent fantasies involving abduction and control for his entire life. He had spent years trying to suppress these urges, but everything changed when he met Lisa. A few weeks prior to the murder, Shera had walked into the card shop to buy a music box as a gift for his wife. Lisa was working behind the counter that day. As soon as he saw her, he became completely obsessed with her. His dark fantasies focused entirely on her, and he began to plan how he would take her. On the night of April 15th, as he watched through the window, he saw Lisa walk into the back storage room. Realizing she was completely alone and that the surrounding stores were closed, Shera decided to act. He walked to the front door, pushed it open, causing the bell to jingle, and stepped inside. Lisa, hearing the bell, walked out of the back room to greet the customer. Shera immediately pulled out a knife, grabbed her, and forced her back into the storage room. Lisa did not submit easily. She began to fight back with incredible strength, desperate to escape. During the violent struggle, they crashed into a large stack of cardboard boxes, flattening them and spilling blood across the floor as Lisa tried to grab the knife from his hands. Despite her brave fight, Shera managed to overpower her. He dragged her out the back door of the storage room, leaving scuff marks on the threshold, and pulled her into the dark alleyway. He shoved her into his vehicle and quickly drove away from the plaza. He drove less than a mile down Route 75 before turning onto a dark, muddy dirt path that led deep into the swampy woods. He drove as far as his vehicle could handle before stopping in a secluded clearing. He forced Lisa out of the vehicle, assaulted her, and then stabbed her to death to prevent her from identifying him. He left her body next to a tree and drove out of the woods, navigating the thick mud. When Shera arrived back at his home later that night, he was still filled with adrenaline. He felt a sense of power and satisfaction, believing he had committed the perfect crime. But as he stepped through his front door, his wife's voice called out from another room, asking him where he had been all evening. Shera looked down at his hands and realized they were covered in deep cuts and scratches from his struggle with Lisa. He knew that if he tried to hide or make an excuse to leave, his wife would become highly suspicious. He took a deep breath, walked into the room, and made up a story about his whereabouts, hoping she would not notice the fresh injuries on his hands. In January of 1993, Shera's wife had actually called the police tip line. She explained that on the night of Lisa's murder, her husband had returned home late with deep scratches on his hands, and that he had been acting strange ever since. She suggested that they look into him. However, at the time, she and Shera were going through a highly contentious and bitter divorce. She was also struggling with severe alcoholism. Because of these factors, the detectives handling the case dismissed her tip, believing she was simply trying to get revenge on her husband during their divorce proceedings. Additionally, the department was overwhelmed with hundreds of similar tips from angry spouses, and Shera's name was simply filed away in a box and forgotten. For 25 years, Shera lived his life as a free man, believing he had gotten away with murder. But in September of 2017, when state troopers knocked on his door and presented him with a legally binding warrant to collect his DNA, he realized his time had run out. He knew that his DNA would perfectly match the evidence left at the crime scene. In a state of panic, Shera sat down and wrote a detailed confession letter. He addressed one letter to his current girlfriend, explaining what he had done and apologizing for the pain he was about to cause. He also wrote a letter of confession addressed directly to the Ziggert family. After writing the letters, Shera attempted to end his own life. However, his girlfriend arrived home, found him, and called for emergency services. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to the hospital, where doctors were able to save his life. While he was recovering in his hospital bed, police officers guarded his room. The DNA sample they collected from him was rushed to the lab, and within days, the results confirmed an exact match to the DNA found on Lisa Ziggert's body. On September 16, 2017, Gary Shera was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. 2 years later, during his trial, faced with the overwhelming scientific evidence and his own written confession, Shera chose to plead guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. The resolution of the case brought a sense of closure to the town of Agawam and to Lisa's family, who had spent 25 years wondering who had taken their beloved daughter and sister. Though the pain of her loss would never truly fade, they finally had the answers they had desperately sought for a quarter of a century. Now, to put the magnitude of this case into proper perspective, we must look at the ripple effect it had on the lives of everyone involved. For 25 years, the cloud of suspicion had hung over innocent men like Blair Massoya and Ed Borgatti. The community, desperate for someone to blame, had whispered behind their backs, constructing wild conspiracy theories that tore at the fabric of their lives. The emotional toll of being falsely accused in the court of public opinion is a heavy burden to carry, and even though DNA evidence had cleared them behind closed doors, the lack of public confirmation meant they had to live under a shadow of doubt for over 2 decades. When Gary Shera was finally unmasked, it was not just a victory for the justice system. It was a profound liberation for these men who had been forced to carry the weight of a crime they had absolutely nothing to do with. The Ziggert family, too, had to navigate a landscape of unimaginable grief. Lisa's mother, her father, and her sisters had spent 25 anniversaries looking at her empty chair at the dinner table, wondering if the monster who took her was still walking among them in their small town. They had watched as the years turned into decades, watching other families find answers while their own case remained frozen in time. The realization that Lisa's killer was simply a customer who had walked into her shop, developed a senseless, dark obsession, and executed a horrific fantasy was a bitter pill to swallow. It proved that the world could be a deeply unpredictable and dangerous place, where ordinary routines could be shattered in an instant. Yet, despite the tragedy, the legacy of Lisa Ziggert is not defined by the violence of her end, but by the love and devotion of the community that refused to forget her. For 25 years, her family, her friends, and the detectives of the Agawam Police Department kept her memory alive. They refused to let her case become just another dusty file in a basement. District Attorney Anthony Galloon, who was just a 12-year-old boy when the tragedy occurred, carried that memory with him all the way to the district attorney's office, using the power of modern science to fulfill a promise made to a grieving family decades earlier. The story of Lisa Ziggert is a testament to the fact that justice, no matter how long it takes, can eventually find its way to the light. It serves as a reminder that the bonds of family and community are stronger than the darkness of a single individual's actions. As Gary Shera sits in a maximum security prison cell, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, the memory of Lisa Ziggert remains bright in the hearts of those who loved her, a shining example of a life well lived, cut tragically short, but never forgotten. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.